All right, guys, I think we're live.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Home Buying with Alan and Eric. I'm Alan,
And I'm Eric.
and we're your home guys. And with us this evening, we have real estate attorney Tania Bartolini. Hi, Tania. Welcome to the program again.
Thank you for having me again.
Oh, it's so great to have you. We had Tania on for title, and now we're going to discuss some legal issues involved with the buying process. So I'll go to Eric and defer to him first. I'm sure Eric is loaded with questions, right?
I have some questions.
Okay.
So you're saying there's legal applications to buy in a home.
Well, I don't know if, it depends on who you're dealing with.
Yeah.
I mean, some people would consider, just kind of do a little piece of paper exchange, maybe monopoly money, but in the real world.
It's funny, this topic, because I talk to people who haven't bought a home in a long time. They're like, we never had to do this. It was so much easier, and there's so much and that's why, Tania, that's why having title, having someone like you is imperative. We need this. And before we hopped on live, we're talking about contracts, and it's everything that we do in real estate is contract related. The closing dates, the approval dates. There's all these timelines that go into it, and I would like you to tell us, because you were educating us a little bit on some of the changes that are coming out very soon in contracts. So I'm curious if you can enlighten us and the viewers on what changes are coming up.
Well, there are a few changes, and we don't have enough time for me to go into all of them. However, one of the major changes is that appraisals have to be done within the loan approval period. Whereas previously and now, what you have is you have a loan approval period of like 30 days or so, or whatever you contract for. You get the conditional approval, and then you get an appraisal and figure out where to go. Now, moving forward, that appraisal has to be done within the first time frame, and the conditional approval cannot be conditioned on the appraisal, because the appraisal had to be already done prior to that. So that's a big thing. The other one is that the seller actually has to request in writing from the buyer to get an update on the status of the loan approval. And text messages do not count. You can email, but text messages don't count. So those are two.
Sorry, that's a very interesting one, because I've had one recently where we had a closing date, and the buyer was having trouble with the lender, and then after underwriting.
It wasn't cross-country mortgage. It wasn't cross-country mortgage, by the way.
No, it definitely was not. It definitely was not. I had nothing to do with who selects the mortgage company. And what happened was there were new conditions that came up, and one of those conditions was the lender wanted more money from the buyer than was originally thought. And the buyer didn't have that cash on hand. So the whole deal had to be switched to another lender. And there were some mistakes made along the way with communication on the end of the buyer, or I should say the buyer and the team and the mortgage broker, to the point where they had already requested a financing extension as well as closing extension, but then they didn't request another financing extension, and they passed the date for when they needed to send us in writing whether they want a release and cancellation or would like another extension on financing. Now the situation becomes they keep extending, their issues getting the loan, and there's no communication at all. And at one point, the seller said, they threw their arms up in the air and said, you know what? Forget about it. I'm going to keep their money, their deposit. Is that legal?
So I can't give you legal advice on any given situation because I need to actually see the full contract, the communications, any addendums, etc. But generally speaking, the purchase contract will give a certain amount of time for the financing contingency. And if the buyer does not terminate that contract within that time frame, then the buyer is deemed to move forward with the contract as if he or she were approved. And so that means they will have to come up with the money one way or another to do the closing. And if they don't, the seller would likely be entitled to the full deposit, and they might be entitled to something called performance. So they could sue the potential buyer and make them purchase the property at the contracted for price.
Right. That was basically a rhetorical question, but I asked it because I want our audience of hopeful buyers out there to understand that the things that are written in the contract, you need to pay attention to them and need to have the right people on your team that can help guide you and inform you as to what you need to do. Someone like Eric who knows the ins and outs and will guide you every step of the way as to what the timeline is for contract, for inspection, and all the time frames when you're supposed to have the appraisal by and all those other things. So thank you for elucidating that.
So, I mean, it really does make a huge difference. You need to work with a lender like Eric, who's going to be on top of things, because lenders don't really have liability for approvals and non-approvals, okay? They don't have to approve anybody, right? So when you have a lender, like when the scenario that you were talking about, they can really put the buyer in a bad position because most buyers don't understand the ramifications, and the lender is telling them, oh, we're in the process, we're doing this, we're doing that, so just keep going. And all of a sudden the buyer's now outside of the time frame. They don't know any better. They think everything's going fine, and they get hit with losing their deposit. So working with, good lenders and good realtors is huge. It makes a huge difference to the buyers.
Yeah, and even so, even the property type comes into play, and the loan type. You need to be working with somebody that says, hey, this is a single family, or it's a single family property or a townhouse where we don't need the condo approval. There's a lot of different aspects that come into play. And all right, this one, 21 days, not a problem. This year, but when you start adding in condo approvals, or if you're a self-employed borrower and you're taking advantage of some of the great bank statement loans, debt service loans, some of the abstract, you need to know, yes, they're great programs, but they're not as fast through underwriting. And that's why you need to work with somebody who can really guide you. Hey, you're qualified for this, and somebody who's on the same page as the realtors. Just because I get a contract that says, hey, the listing agent wants to close in 14 days, before I even get this in, we're going to have a conversation that says, listen, based on this whole scenario, it's going to be 21, it's going to be 30. Or there's certain times where I can close in 10 to 14 days. And that's where it all circles around in the communication. I love these new changes. I may be different than everybody else, but I think it's super, these contract changes. I
think you love them because you're already on top of your stuff. So it really doesn't make a difference.
Well, also, I think that rules and regulations, guidelines, they really help us.
Yeah.
Because they help give us a time frame for knowing what we need to do and when we need to do it. If we don't have those, everything is loosey-goosey, and that's not good. And in real estate, four of the most important words are, is it four? Time is of the essence. 5 words, excuse me. Time is of the essence, and a lot of people don't realize that. And that's so important. And that time could really hurt them, as we just illustrated, from a legal point of view. Another question I have for you from a legal point of view is, we all typically have inspections done, and the sellers will typically do a seller's real property disclosure. Now, in the contracts nowadays, there's a disclosure, but it's not a full disclosure the way the real property disclosure is done. So I always ask my sellers to prepare it for me. I legally am not allowed to, or should not, because if I write anything in there, then I am legally bound to those responses. So for me, it's a hands-off thing as a realtor, and I give it to the client, they fill it out, and I hold on to it in the event that the buyer's agent requests the real property disclosure. So now, let's say hypothetically, we have a deal and we disclose that we have no knowledge of leaks in the home. And the answers are either yes, no, or I don't know. And we say, when it says, have there been any leaks in the home? No, gets crossed off. Okay. Now, when the inspection comes, the inspector finds leaks. From a legal point of view, what happens at that point?
Well, at that point, we're still basically good and nobody has any liability, because when the inspector comes back and says there's leaks, the buyer supposedly or should be within that inspection period. And they can either renegotiate the contract to accommodate for those leaks, or they can terminate the contract and get their deposit back. It gets into a sticky situation if the seller said that there are no leaks, the inspection did not reveal any leaks. Then when the closing happened, the buyers move in and they find that there really were leaks that should have been found by the inspector or should have been known by the seller. So now it becomes sticky as to whose responsibility is it. Did the sellers materially misinform the buyers, or did they really not know about the leaks? Because if they didn't know about them, then the sellers will not have any liability. Okay, you're only liable for what you know and what you do. And so the inspector may or may not be liable, depending on the contract with the inspector and what it was that they were supposed to inspect. And the buyers now may or may not be stuck with those expenses. So it's very important to have a very good inspector, pay extra for the full inspection, because, you know, most of the time when you're living in a home, there could be things that are happening that you don't know anything about because they're behind the walls or under the floorboards or whatever the case might be. So you are in good faith answering and trying to sell it without knowing these things, right? So the buyers need to do their due diligence well and make sure that they're not stuck with problems that they did not anticipate.
Right.
So I have a question because I don't know. So let's say a seller malicious, they don't know, or they do know something happened, and then it goes into something has to go into litigation. How long does that take to go through?
Okay, so litigation can be anywhere from a few months to 10 years. It just depends on each case. The biggest problem when it comes to sellers, misinforming or knowing that there's an issue, trying to hide it, and then writing that there is no issue is trying to prove the fact that they knew, right? So if you go in and you find that there was stucco, to hide something, well, someone put that there. Okay, so it's a lot easier to prove that the seller knew of this, they fixed it or tried to hide it, and then, misrepresented the whole situation. Other situations, it's a little bit more difficult to prove that the seller knew about it, right? So that's why I say every case is different, and it really is upon the buyer to do their due diligence. If I may, I had a case where the seller put down that it was city sewer, and it turned out to be septic. Yeah. And now it's a matter of, okay, the seller knew or should have known that it was septic. There's no way they would have thought it was city if they were living there for a year, right? But what are the damages, and is it worth it to go after them or get out of the house? So even if it is something that you can prove, sometimes you have to see whether or not it's worth, going after them or litigating, because it is so time consuming and it can be costly.
Like any litigation.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I can say this. There are some states where it's required that an attorney is involved with the closings and the contracts and the closings. Florida is not one of those states, but I highly recommend to any buyers, especially if they're buying a home that's, let's just say, for argument's sake, $500,000 or more, to go over things with their attorney too, because as a realtor, I cannot give legal advice. I just can't do that. I have opinions, but legal advice I cannot give. And I clearly let clients know I cannot give you legal advice. Eric, the same, cannot give legal advice. So if they need legal advice, they need to go to an attorney. And there are things that attorneys know and can do that we can't do. It's a big purchase.
Yeah, I definitely let people know I have plenty of opinions. but with that and 95 cents, it'll get you a stick of gum. It's not going to get you very far. So,
well, that's great. I'm sure we have so many more legal issues to be discussed, so we could discuss it another time. Tanya, I want to thank you again for joining us. Eric, good to see you as always, and all of you out there, and look forward to seeing you next Monday evening, 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for joining.